For thousands of years, nomadic peoples roamed the vast steppes of Central Asia and southern Russia. Contrary to the old stereotype, these nomads were not just rough raiders on horseback. They had their own cultures, art, and systems of life. In fact, some of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries ever made come from these grasslands. The Scythians, an Iranian-speaking people, dominated the steppe between the 7th and 3rd centuries BCE. They were fierce warriors, but also patrons of the arts, who often commissioned Greek craftsmen for these works. Many of their tombs have yielded breathtaking and spectacular finds. After the Scythians faded, other groups rose in their place: the Sarmatians, the Huns, and eventually the Khazars. Historians such as Peter Benjamin Golden remind us that steppe societies were not just marauders. Many were deeply engaged in trade, literacy, and political organization. Their kingdoms could be as culturally sophisticated as the great civilizations that bordered them. The Turkic peoples in particular left an impressive legacy. In 2001, archaeologists in Mongolia uncovered the tomb of Bilge Kagan, ruler of the Gökturks. The shrine contained thousands of works of art in silver and gold, including sculptures and a crown decorated with a mythological bird. It was within this Turkic world that the Khazars appeared. They began as nomadic horsemen who practiced shamanism. Over time, they adopted settled life, built a kingdom, and embraced new religions like Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, while still carrying traces of their older steppe traditions. The Khazars were mainly Turkic in origin, though the details of their earliest roots are murky. Ancient writers, from the Byzantine historian Theophanes to the Arab geographer al-Masudi and the Chinese chroniclers, consistently described them as Turks. Later Jewish and European scholars echoed the same. Legends even placed the Khazars as brothers of other Turkic tribes like the Bulgars and Sibirs. Modern genetics backs up parts of these legends. Studies show that Turkic-speaking peoples share a common ancestry rooted in southern Siberia and Mongolia, though centuries of mixing with neighboring populations created their great diversity. Some Turks had East Asian features, while others looked more European or Middle Eastern. The Khazars themselves reflected this variety. Some sources describe them as fair-skinned and blue-eyed, others as darker. Arabic accounts even spoke of white Khazars and black Khazars, though this may have been a social distinction rather than a racial one. Archaeological finds near Sarkel suggest that Khazars included both Slavic-looking and European types, with only a few showing clear East Asian traits. Scholars over the centuries have debated Khazar origins endlessly. Some thought they were related to the Finno-Ugrians, others to Armenians, Circassians, or even Hephthalites from Persia. Soviet historians, working under ideological pressure, argued that they were native to the Caucasus. But the bulk of evidence points to their Turkic identity, formed through westward migrations, and later blended with local peoples under their empire. Even the name Khazar is debated. It may come from the Turkic word khaz, to wander, combined with man, meaning wandering man. Others link it to Chinese tribal names, or even to the Roman title Caesar, passed through Persian as Caesar. The rise of the Khazars took place in the late 7th century, a time period when the Gökturks Empire was in its weakened state, and its western territories became fertile ground for new powers to rise. This was the political vacuum, out of which the Khazars emerged as one of the most successful heirs. They adopted Turkic titles, practiced the diplomatic balancing act between Byzantium and the Caliphate, and carried forward the traditions of nomadic statecraft perfected by their predecessors. Their homeland lay between the Black Sea and the Caspian, a crossroads of civilizations where the steppe met the Caucasus and the great trade routes of Eurasia. Whoever controlled this region could tax merchants, guard the passes, and dominate the flow of silk, furs, grain, and slaves. By the 9th century, the Khazars had reached the peak of their power. Their empire stretched from the steppes north of the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea and deep into the Caucasus. They controlled the lower Volga and Don rivers, commanding the crucial crossroads between Europe, the Islamic world, and Central Asia. Their influence was felt in every direction. To the north, they dominated the Slavic and Finnic tribes, collecting tribute from peoples who would later form the core of Russia. To the west, they checked the advance of the Magyars before they migrated into Hungary. To the south, they held the Caucasus passes, keeping Arab armies at bay. To the east, they linked up with Turkic tribes and Silk Road merchants. The Khazars were not just warriors, they were master diplomats. They played Byzantium and the Caliphate against one another, sometimes allying with Constantinople, other times siding with Baghdad. At first, the Khazars clashed with Byzantium. The empire in Constantinople viewed them as dangerous nomads on their northern frontier. Yet, as the Arabs began pushing northward in the 7th century, threatening both Byzantium and the steppe, the Khazars suddenly became valuable allies. Between 642 and 799, the Khazars fought a series of brutal wars against the Arab Caliphate. Arab armies repeatedly tried to break through the Caucasus Mountains and expand into the steppes, but the Khazars held the passes with fierce resistance. One of the most famous battles took place near Balanjar, where Khazar warriors rolled flaming carts down a hillside to smash into Arab troops. Although the Arabs occasionally won victories, they never fully subdued the Khazars. In fact, the Khazar state became a protective buffer for Byzantium, shielding Eastern Europe from Islamic expansion. By the early 8th century, the Byzantines recognized the value of this partnership. Emperor Justinian II even sealed the alliance by marrying a Khazar princess. Their son would later become emperor as Leo IV, remembered in history as Leo the Khazar. A very few written evidence survives about Khazar daily life, so archaeology provides our best window into their culture. Excavations show that the Khazars were industrious farmers, herders, and craftsmen who produced goods for both local use and export. Medieval writers often portrayed the Khazars as consumers rather than producers, claiming that they imported most goods. Yet archaeology proves otherwise. Khazaria had thriving industries. Blacksmiths and potters worked in large numbers, producing tools, weapons, pottery, jewelry, saddles, and ornaments. The Saltovo-Mayaki culture, centered along the Don and Donets rivers, showcased Khazar creativity. They made amulets of metal, bone, and even animal teeth, often with symbolic designs, although after Judaism spread, these pagan motifs declined. Pottery was widespread, and kilns are discovered throughout Crimean towns and river settlements. Amphora workshops reveal large-scale production. Pottery was decorated with patterns, tribal symbols, or unique potter's marks. Jewelry was crafted from gold, silver, bronze, and glass, often featuring detailed motifs. Other finds include felt hats, ornate boots decorated with silver plates, and remarkable horn carvings showing soldiers, animals, and dragons, which is evidence of influences from both the East and West. The Khazars also produced a full range of weapons: axes, sabers, bows, chainmail, and helmets. Their weapon designs reflected both steppe traditions and contact with neighboring cultures. Khazar artisans traded widely. Saltovian pottery and metalwork reached Slavic regions, influencing early Kievan material culture. Finds from Ukraine show Slavic households using Khazar amphoras and plaques, while Khazar craftsmen adapted to Slavic styles in return. Agriculture, herding, hunting, and fishing sustained Khazar society. In the fertile northern zones, farming dominated, while in the southern steppes, pastoralism prevailed. Excavations show the use of plows, sickles, scythes, and irrigation systems. Crops included millet, wheat, barley, rye, hemp, peas, grapes, and fruit. Grapevines and vineyards were especially important, producing large quantities of wine in Crimea and the Taman Peninsula. King Joseph's famous reply describes Khazar families tending hereditary estates, cultivating orchards, and relying on rivers for irrigation where rainfall was scarce. Fishing was essential. Nets, hooks, and spears have been found, and sturgeon and beluga were staple catches. Animal husbandry was equally important. Horses, sheep, cattle, goats, pigs, camels, and poultry were kept. Horses served for transport, war, and food. Sheep for wool. Camels carried goods, and bees provided honey. Hunting added variety, with game including deer, boar, beavers, and rabbits. Khazars, like their Turkic kin, wore long coats or kaftans. Archaeology confirms their resemblance to later Jewish and steppe styles. Hairstyles followed Turkic custom. Nobles and warriors braided their hair, while long flowing hair was reserved for the Kagan. Relics such as decorated scoops and horns show braided warriors, and ritual motifs tied to traditions of ruler sacrifice. Burials varied widely: catacomb graves, kurgans, cenotaphs, and horse burials. Pagan graves often included weapons, jewelry, pottery, saddles, and foreign objects, reflecting both shamanistic belief and wide trade connections. Sites like Upper Saltov and Sarkal reveal graves with ornaments, weapons, and ritual offerings. Shamanistic sacrifices of humans or animals under buildings also occurred. Some evidence points to earlier cremation practices, later abandoned with the spread of Judaism. The supreme ruler of the Khazars was the Kagan, giving rise to the term Khaganate for their state. By the later period of Khazar history, the Kagan was less an active ruler and more a sacred figure living apart from the public. Turks believed that Khagans were appointed by Tengri, the sky god, and endowed with divine fortune to guide the empire. The Kagan was credited with establishing the laws that shaped Khazar governance. The office was hereditary, and some traditions linked Khazar Khagans to the ancient Asina clan that had once ruled the eastern and western Turkic empires. Scholars debate this connection. While some point to the name Ansa in Persian sources as evidence, others argue that this does not prove Asina descent. A peculiar tradition associated with Turkic rulers, and possibly the Khazars, was the ritual killing of a Kagan after a set number of years in power. Arab and Chinese accounts describe ceremonies where nobles strangled a ruler with silk or silver cords, demanding he declare how long he intended to reign. If his term exceeded the limit, he could be executed. Many historians, however, believe that this custom did not survive after the Khazars' conversion to Judaism, as human sacrifice was forbidden. Later references to it were likely misunderstandings based on older Turkic practices. The Kagan's wife was known as the Khatun. Some sources, such as Ibn Fadlan, claimed that the Kagan maintained a vast harem, but this is doubtful since Judaism, which the Khazar elite had adopted, generally discouraged polygamy. Instead, these wives may have symbolized the various peoples and territories under Khazar control. Over time, only Jews were eligible to become Kagan, beginning with an Israelite sage who, according to the Schechter letter, was chosen as the first Jewish ruler. This shift emphasized Judaism's central place in Khazar political and religious life. Burial practices for Khagans were described in vivid detail by Arab writers. They spoke of elaborate mausoleums with multiple hidden chambers, rivers diverted to flow over graves, and the execution of gravediggers to keep the burial site secret. Whether these practices were real or exaggerated remains uncertain, as no mausoleums have been found. By the 9th century, the Kagan's role had declined. Once both ruler and military commander, by the 830s, he had ceded real authority to another leader, the Bek. Thereafter, the Kagan functioned mainly as a spiritual figurehead, while the Bek directed political and military affairs. As the Kagan had lost political power, the Bek was the active head of state. He governed, judged, punished, and commanded the Khazar armies, though formally he was considered subordinate to the Kagan. Unlike the secluded Kagan, the Bek appeared in public and carried out the day-to-day business of rule. The Khazar army was his greatest tool. It was a permanent, professional force, rare in its time, and included not only Khazars but also foreign soldiers. Arab accounts describe the army as disciplined and well-equipped, with mail armor, spears, banners, and strict encampment procedures. Scouts carried wax flares to guide night movements, while soldiers enclosed camps with pegs and shields for defense. Victories brought plunder, which was first presented to the Bek, then divided among soldiers. Defeat, however, was met with brutal punishment. Returning officers could be executed, enslaved, or humiliated. Though some descriptions may be exaggerated, they reflect the army's central role in Khazaria's survival and power. Despite his authority, the Bek still symbolically deferred to the Kagan. Ibn Fadlan recounts that the Bek entered the Kagan's presence barefoot, with a burning stick in hand, before taking his place at the ruler's side. Yet over time, the Bek's influence surpassed that of the Kagan, and by the 10th century the leading Khazar rulers mentioned by name, Benjamin, Aaron, Joseph, were Beks, not Kagans. Below the Bek stood other high officials. The Kender was third in command, followed by his deputy, the Javshigar. Their exact duties are uncertain. Some scholars link the Javshigar to hunting traditions or military marshals who kept order in the royal court. Beyond them were the Tarkans, generals, and governors who commanded troops or provinces. These offices reflect the structured hierarchy of Khazar administration. Justice in Khazaria was handled by a unique 7-member court in Atil, the capital. It included 2 Jewish, 2 Christian, 2 Muslim, and 1 pagan judge. This arrangement ensured that cases were judged according to the litigant's religion. Jews used the Torah, Muslims the Sharia, Christians their own canon law. The court mostly oversaw trade disputes, and this was actually fitting for a kingdom that thrived on commerce. Scholars suggest that the court represented the diverse merchant population of Atil. Compared with the religious strife in Byzantium or Western Europe, Khazaria's judicial system demonstrated an unusual degree of tolerance and coexistence. Provincial governance was handled by officials called Tuduns, appointed by the Khagan. They collected taxes and supervised territories, including parts of Crimea. Alongside them were Balikis, or fishermen, who controlled coastal cities like Kerch and Samkarsh, reflecting Khazaria's reliance on fishing and maritime trade. Some local leaders, called Babaguks, fathers of the city, were elected rather than appointed. Other subordinate rulers were known as Eltebers, who governed tributary peoples such as the Magyars, Bulgars, and Burtas. In addition, Khazaria's Muslim community had its own chief official, the vizier, chosen from military slaves. Some historians even connect the name of one Khazar vizier to the legendary key of Rus. The Khazar state maintained a structured system of taxation to support its government and military. Blacksmiths' products, food, and drink were subject to tax, and merchants, especially Muslim traders in Atil, often paid their dues in provisions. Customs duties on merchandise and transport brought in steady revenue, but the most profitable source was maritime trade tariffs. This income funded the salaries of soldiers, border guards, judges, rabbis, and governors. It also maintained synagogues, courts, and the royal palace. The taxation was the backbone of Khazaria's administration, sustaining both its army and its religious political institutions. At its height, Khazaria commanded a vast empire stretching between the Black and the Caspian Seas, with influence reaching the Volga and the Caucasus. Many neighboring peoples acknowledged Khazar overlordship and paid tribute. By the late 8th century, the Khazars dominated groups such as the Alans, Hungarians, Bulgars, and various Slavic tribes. The Russian Primary Chronicle records that in the mid-9th century, the Polyaenians, Severians, and Viatikians each paid a white squirrel skin per household as tribute. Other groups, like the Radomikians, were also under Khazar control. Later, Prince Oleg of Kiev challenged this dominance, conquering some tribes that had previously paid tribute to the Khazars. Even so, King Joseph of Khazaria, writing around 955, still claimed authority over several Slavic groups. Disputes between Byzantine and Rus sources highlight how contested Khazar overlordship was during the 10th century. Beyond the Slavs, the Volga Bulgars, Burtas, Pecheneg, and Magyars also submitted tribute. The Alans, too, were partly subject to Khazaria, though their western branches leaned more toward Byzantium. This wide network of tributary peoples illustrates the reach of Khazar power, even if it was sometimes more nominal than absolute. From the 8th to 9th centuries, Khazaria became one of Eurasia's key commercial hubs. Persian geographers described it as prosperous, rich in livestock, and a major supplier of slaves. Its location gave it control over routes connecting east and west. The Volga, Don, Caspian, and Black Sea corridors all passed through Khazar lands. Customs duties formed a major source of revenue. Traders, whether Rus, Arabs, or others, paid taxes at Atil and other checkpoints. At Sarkal, for instance, the local governor claimed 1/10 of all goods passing through. Khazar nobles themselves joined in commerce, trading products such as honey, wax, and wine. Samandar in particular was famous for its vineyards. Khazar artisans also exported silver bowls, belts, and ornaments to the Urals, Siberia, and Kievan Rus. Some items came from abroad but were redistributed by Khazar merchants, such as Central Asian silverware or Persian coins. Until the late 9th century, Arabic silver dirhams passed through Khazaria into Eastern Europe, making the empire a vital link in long-distance trade. Khazar merchants traveled widely. In Khorizm's capital Kath, they purchased quilts, felt, and cotton goods. Caravans moved between Gurganj, Khazaria, and Khorasan, while others came from Volga, Bulgaria, whose markets show traces of Khazar pottery and jewelry. In the Caucasus, Alanic tombs reveal Khazar bells and mirrors. Imports reached Sarkal from Armenia, Iraq, Iran, and Byzantium, while Greek pottery supplied Crimean towns. Khazaria also connected to the Silk Road. From its markets, traders could travel east to Turfan, Kashgar, and even China. In return came silk, spices, perfumes, coral, ivory, gems, and cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean. Paper from Samarkand and Chinese mirrors likewise passed through Khazarian hands. Contacts extended as far as Scandinavia. In Birka, a major Viking port, graves contained Khazar belts, ceramics, and clothing resembling Khazar styles. Scholars debate whether Khazars themselves lived there, or whether these objects arrived via Rus intermediaries, but either way, Khazarian goods influenced Northern Europe. The Khazars' prosperity centered on their capital Atil, on the Volga River. Arab geographers described it as a sprawling city with two main sections, one on each side of the river, connected by bridges and ferries. One district housed the royal palace and government. Another contained bustling markets filled with merchants from every corner of the known world. Separate quarters were reserved for Muslims, Christians, Jews, and pagans, each with their own judges, laws, and houses of worship. Atil was cosmopolitan in a way few medieval cities were. A Scandinavian trader could sell furs to a Muslim merchant, who might then buy slaves from a Slavic dealer, all under the watchful eyes of Khazar tax collectors. Khazaria eventually minted its own silver dirhams, beginning around the 820s. These imitated Abbasid coins in style and inscriptions, but often contained errors in spelling and dates, and this was because of local Jewish engravers who were unfamiliar with Arabic. Four main series of Khazar dirhams were issued around 837 and 838. One bore the inscription Ard al-Khazar, land of the Khazars, while another replaced the Islamic formula, Muhammad is the messenger of God, with the striking declaration, Moses is the messenger of God. Other Khazar coins carried tribal signs or bore names like Jalil or Khalil, probably those of engravers. Later imitations lacked such distinctive features. Coins from Byzantium, the Abbasids, and pre-Islamic Persia also circulated in Khazaria, discovered in graves and settlements across the empire. These finds confirm Khazaria's deep integration into the monetary systems of the medieval world. Most scholars agree that the Khazars spoke a Turkic language. Even in their own time, Muslim geographers described them as Turkic, and modern research has largely confirmed this. The problem is that almost nothing of their language survives directly, leaving scholars to work with scraps of evidence, borrowed names, and scattered references. Serious study of the Khazar language began in the 1970s with Peter Golden, followed by an energetic wave of research in the early 1980s. Works by Golden, Ludwig, and Golb and Pritzak collected and debated most of what we know today. Since then, further studies have refined these ideas, but with so little material, progress has been limited. Unless some new inscription turns up, our knowledge will remain fragmentary. The existing inscriptions attributed to the Khazars are still undeciphered strings of symbols, with no secure reading. The central debate is whether Khazar belonged to the Bulgar Chuvash branch of Turkic, or to mainstream Common Turkic. Chuvash, spoken today along the Volga, is the only survivor of the Bulgar branch. Its closest relative, Volga Bulgar, is attested in inscriptions from the 13th and 14th centuries. Scholars agree that this branch split off early, even before the earliest Turkic texts, like the Orkhon inscriptions of the 8th century. Many linguists think that Khazar belonged to this branch, while others argue that it was closer to Common Turkic. Recent decades have clarified the Bulgar Chuvash picture. We now know Volga Bulgar was distinct, but still a fairly typical Turkic language. This makes it easier to test whether Khazar belonged here. Some earlier theories that Bulgar Chuvash was halfway between Turkic and Mongolic no longer hold water. Chuvash does share features with Mongolic, like certain sound changes, but these are better explained as borrowings or contact phenomena rather than genetic links. The few Khazar words and titles we can identify are unmistakably Turkic. Some titles are also clearly Turkic. For example, the office transcribed as Jawasigar in Arabic sources is better understood as Kavasyigar, meaning Marshal of the Kavis, officials who organized ranks in battle and maintained order at court. This role existed already in early Turkic polities and later in the Ottoman system. Other titles, however, came from the wider Central Eurasian pool. The Khazars, like many steppe states, borrowed political titles from older powers and neighboring cultures. One example is Iltibar, a title seen in Turkic, Sogdian, Bactrian, and even Chinese sources, with many different forms. The Khazar Khaganate was one of the most religiously diverse societies of the early medieval world. Its territory lay between Byzantium to the west, the Caliphate to the south, and the steppes to the north, and this crossroads position brought competing faiths into close contact. The Khazars had to navigate not only the military and political pressures of their neighbors, but also their religious ambitions, as both Constantinople and Baghdad hoped to draw the Khazars into their spiritual spheres of influence. In their earliest phase, the Khazars followed the religious traditions common to Turkic and steppe peoples. This was a blend of Tengrism, reverence for the eternal blue sky Tengri, together with cults of fire, earth, and ancestors. Shamanistic rituals, animal sacrifices, and reverence for natural spirits were integral to this system. Archaeological material from Khazar period burials confirms the persistence of these older traditions. Horse sacrifices, grave goods placed with warriors, and evidence of cremation or fire rituals fit squarely into steppe pagan practices that long predated Khazaria. Even when foreign religions began spreading through the Khaganate, these older practices remained widespread among the common people and the nomadic elements of the Khazar Federation. Paganism did not vanish. Instead, it coexisted with Christianity, Islam, and Judaism well into the 9th and 10th centuries. The Christian presence in Khazaria came primarily through Byzantium. From the late 6th and early 7th centuries, Byzantine missionaries traveled into the steppe and the Caucasus, seeking to convert the Alans and other tribes allied with the Khazars. The empire saw Christianity not only as a spiritual mission, but also as a tool for political alliance. The most famous Byzantine missionary to visit Khazaria was Constantine, who would later invent the Glagolitic alphabet and inspire the Cyrillic script. In the 860s, Constantine and his brother Methodius were dispatched to the Khazar court, where he reportedly engaged in theological debates with Christian, Muslim, and Jewish representatives before the Khagan. His hagiography describes how he impressed the Khazars with his knowledge of languages, scriptures, and philosophy. Christian communities did take root in Khazar territory. Archaeological remains of churches have been identified in the Caucasus and near Khazar towns. Byzantine sources mention baptisms of Khazar nobles, and some of the Alans and Slavs under Khazar influence were Christianized. However, Christianity never became the dominant religion of the Khazars themselves. For the Khagan and his elite, adopting Byzantine Christianity would have meant accepting the spiritual authority and political influence of Constantinople, something that the Khazars avoided. Islam entered Khazaria from the south, through the Caucasus and across the Caspian Sea. As early as the 8th century, Muslim merchants and settlers established quarters in Khazar cities. The capital Atil had a significant Muslim population. Arabic geographers note that the Muslims of Atil had their own mosques, judges appointed by the caliph, and even Islamic schools. The Arab geographer al-Masudi describes Khazar cities with separate quarters for Muslims, Christians, Jews, and pagans. Muslim communities thrived, particularly in trade centers along the Volga and Caspian. Archaeological finds confirm Islamic influence. Coins inscribed with the Shahada, imported Islamic pottery, and Islamic burial practices among certain groups under Khazar rule. Some Khazars converted to Islam, especially among urban dwellers and merchants. However, as with Christianity, wholesale adoption by the ruling class would have aligned the Khaganate too closely with the Caliphate, and in turn would have jeopardized Khazar independence. Instead, Islam became a religion of minorities and mercantile groups within Khazaria. The most debated and well-known religious development in Khazaria is the reported conversion of the ruling elite to Judaism. Sources differ on the exact date, but most place it between the late 8th and early 9th centuries. Arabic writers like al-Masudi, Ibn al-Faqih, and Ibn al-Athir mention that the Khazar king and nobles adopted Judaism, while most of the population followed other faiths. Byzantine authors also refer to the Khazars as Jews. The most detailed account comes from the Khazar Correspondence, a set of Hebrew letters exchanged in the 10th century between the Khazar king Joseph and Hasdai ibn Shaprut, a Jewish courtier in Cordoba. In this account, the Khazar ruler explains that his ancestors had invited representatives of the three great religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, to debate at court. The Khazars rejected the first two, adopting Judaism as a way to remain politically independent. The motives behind this decision were likely as political as they were spiritual. By choosing Judaism, the Khazar elite set themselves apart from both Byzantium and the Caliphate. They avoided subordination to either Christian patriarchs or Muslim caliphs, while also gaining ties to the far-reaching Jewish diaspora, which was active in trade from Spain to Central Asia. As to the question of how far this conversion extended, the answer remains uncertain. Most scholars believe it was limited to the Khagan, the ruling elite, and perhaps sections of the aristocracy. The majority of Khazars continued to practice their older religions or adopted Christianity or Islam, depending on region and context. Archaeological evidence of Judaism in Khazaria is limited, but it does suggest at least some Jewish presence beyond the royal court. By the late 9th century, Khazaria's power was waning. The first Rus Khaganate rose on the Middle Volga in the 830s, and by 885 the East Slavic tribes were united, soon eclipsing Khazar influence. Scandinavian adventurers called Varangians by the Khazars were also integrating into Kievan Rus. Unlike Khazar chiefs, Varangian leaders commanded fleets of ships, earning them the title Kolbegi. In the early 10th century, Khazaria faced constant regional conflicts. In 901, their attack on Derbent failed. Around 913, the Khazar king allowed a Rus fleet of 500 ships down the Volga in exchange for half their loot. But the Rus raided the Caspian coast, killing and enslaving thousands. In retaliation, the people of Atil, joined by local Christians, defeated them in a 3-day battle, killing 30,000, while survivors were hunted by the Burtaz and Volga Bulgars. Tensions continued in the late 930s, when Byzantine Emperor Romanus I encouraged Rus Prince Oleg to attack Samkarsh. Though Oleg briefly succeeded, Khazar General Pasak recaptured the city, enslaved captives, and forced Oleg to campaign against Constantinople. In 941, Oleg's fleet was destroyed by the Byzantine navy, and he eventually perished in Persia. By the mid-10th century, Rus-Khazar hostility was open and continuous. King Joseph himself, writing to Hasta ibn Shaprut in Spain, described how he blockaded Rus ships from entering the Caspian. In 962, Khazar armies struck at Crimea to reassert control, but the Crimean Goths appealed to the Rus for help. Their call was answered by Prince Sviatoslav of Kiev, a warrior whose campaigns would spell the end for Khazaria. Medieval chronicles even preserve a legend foreshadowing Khazaria's fall. When Khazar envoys once demanded tribute from the Slavs, they were given double-edged swords instead of gold. The Khazar chiefs warned their ruler that these weapons would one day be turned against them. The warning proved true. In 965, Sviatoslav launched a decisive campaign. Armed with axes, swords, and iron armor, his warriors captured Sarkal, the Khazars' great fortress on the Don. He then subdued the Alans and Circassians and moved to control tribute from Slavic tribes who were once loyal to the Khazars. Within a few years, Atil itself was sacked. After the fall of Atil in the 960s, Khazaria never recovered as an independent power. Some Khazars fled across the Caspian or south into Shirvan, while others were absorbed by neighboring peoples. A few decades later, a ruler named Georgistsal, likely a Christian ruler, controlled a small district still called Khazaria, probably in Crimea. But when a joint Byzantine-Rus expedition captured him in 1016, even this remnant vanished. Later writers speculated that members of the Khazar royal family fled west, perhaps to Spain, but no firm evidence supports this. Some historians suggested that Khazaria lingered into the 12th or even 13th century under new names like Saxon, but documentation is sparse and such claims are doubtful. What remained was not a Khazar state, but only the memory of one. That memory, however, endured. Italian sources used Khazaria for Crimea into the 16th century. Marco Polo wrote of the Mongols taking Khazaria, and Genoese merchants even maintained an officium Khazari to govern their Crimean ports. Local folklore remembered Khazars in epic tales like Mikhailo the Khazar. Even geography preserved their name. The Caspian Sea was widely called the Khazar Sea, and in Azerbaijan the northern wind is still called the Katsri.